Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Veronica Watson. I'm a professor of English here at IUP in good old Indiana, Pennsylvania. And I just want to welcome you all to the final town hall of our policing series for the semester. I'm so happy to see some returning faces and names, along with some new folks here this evening, and there may be others joining us. So thank you for being here. I'm going to turn this over to our two facilitators and hosts for the evening, Alan and Alexi.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for taking the time to be here with us this evening. And welcome to Examining Police Power, the Courts, Community, and Context. I'm Alexi Cabrera, and I'm from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and I'm a sophomore nursing student. And I'm going to let my wonderful team also introduce themselves as well.
Hey, greetings everyone. My name is Alan Ingram III, and I'm a Cheney University freshman. I major in computer science and minor in graphic design. It's nice to have you all here today.
We may have one other person who's joining us a little bit. He's having trouble getting in, so hopefully Nedrick will be able to join us here shortly as our third facilitator. So I guess I'll just continue right now and tell you how we got to be here this evening. The Frederick Douglass Institute Collaborative has been in the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education for 22 years. And our mission is to serve first-generation low-income and students of color and to connect those groups of students to high-impact educational opportunities. So our universities do a lot of wonderful stuff for a lot of different students. The Frederick Douglass Institute Collaborative really exists to make sure that those students who are most often underserved at our institutions have those opportunities available to them also. Well, we are primarily a face-to-face organization. I mean, a lot of the activities that we do, we have a debate team, we have a conference that we do. And for all of the years that we've been doing those things, we've been doing them face-to-face. And then the pandemic hit. And so like so many other institutions and organizations, we had to figure out how to pivot and start to make connections with and among students in a virtual and online environment. That took us to a connection with the 400 Years of African American History National Commission, who was also in the process of figuring out how to support some work that they were doing and supporting around the country in a virtual environment. The organization that we are creating these resources for, which is the reason why we're recording this evening, is called the National Association of Faith and Justice National Mentoring Program, and that the organization, I'm sorry, the name of that program is Pen or Pencil. And so that's a national mentoring program around the country. And they too were trying to figure out how to maintain those relationships and continue to support students in an online environment. So the resources that we have created have been these town halls that have all been recorded. And once these are uploaded to our archive site, Pen or Pencil sites around the country will be able to access them. So that's the reason why we're being recorded this evening. It's the reason that we're all here this evening. And we really appreciate you being here to participate in the conversation and continue in the learning. So with that, I think my introduction of the program is done, and I'll turn this over to Rachel to talk about how we're going to conduct the evening.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel DeSoto Jackson. I'm a professor at IUP, Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And I have the pleasure of working with this program in building the student training program and helping them to prepare for the facilitation. So just to give you a sense of what this virtual engagement is going to look like. So our panelists are going to have about 10 to 15 minutes to share with you their experience. And we have some guided questions that were prepared to help engage you with the topic. As you're listening, we want to encourage you to actually type out your questions in the chat. So as you're listening, if there are things that come to mind, we don't want you to save them. We want you to actually type them out as you're thinking them so that we can capture them live in the moment. And then at the very end, our facilitators are going to then go back to those questions And then we're going to have a chance to talk about those questions and hear from our panelists. So again, just as you're listening, feel free to use the chat to ask those questions. And then at the very end, we'll go back to those questions so that our panelists have a chance to reflect back on them. And so with that, I will turn it over to our facilitators to introduce our two panelists for the evening.
Great. So I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Ronald Hampton. Mr. Ronald Hampton, he's our first panelist of the night. He's retired from the Metropolitan DC Police Department after 23 years of service as a community relations officer. He is reputed for his outstanding work with the citizens of the 3rd Police District in Washington, D.C. in crime prevention and community participation and relations. Mr. Hampton is the immediate past executive director of the National Black Police Association, presently serving with Blacks in Law Enforcement of America and chair of IBW's Police Reform and Accountability Task Force. Additionally, he has served as a law enforcement fellow at the University of the District of Columbia's Institute for Public Safety and Justice. Such a pleasure working with him. And now Alan is going to introduce Dr. Paulos.
All right. I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Paulos, or yes. So Professor Rachel Paulos, when she was unanimously confirmed by United States Senate to serve as United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota in 2006, Rachel Kunjman Paulos became the first Indian American in American history to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate for any federal appointment. Under Pelosi's leadership, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Minnesota recorded the highest number of prosecutions in its history, reflecting the collaborative hard work of law enforcement partners, attorneys, staff, and civic leaders. She has been a great columnist for the Asian American press and is a frequent contributing author to the American Bar Association preview of Supreme Court cases. She has also provided legal analysis for the Washington Post, ABC, USA Today, NPR, CBS, and the St. Paul Pioneer Press, among other media representatives. Paulos received her JD from the Yale Law School, where she was a Coker Fellow, editor of the Yale Journal of Law and Feminism, and a commencement standard bearer. She is currently a visiting professor at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. May we have y'all congratulate or give a hand of applause to Ms. Rachel Paulos and Mr. Ronald Hampton, please.
I think we can advance the slide.
Okay.
So Mr. Hampton, you're going to be the first speaker for the evening.
Okay. Okay. I have your permission to go.
You do indeed, sir.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me. And I consider this an honor and a pleasure also, the opportunity to talk about policing. There are a couple of questions on the screen. Let me read the questions and then I want to get into my dialogue. What does the training of police officers consist of? Number one, has the police training been refined through the years? And is the training applicable to other police related settings? Well, let me say this, that I don't think it has changed. Police have been around for about 100 and it's about 100, maybe 150, 160 years. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the basic police training is pretty much the same. You know, it consists of a driver's ed. It consists of you learning the laws and the different policies that related to the state or city that you live and work in. There's also firearms training, and there's a lot of emphasis placed on firearms training. There's a lot of emphasis that are placed on what we call a de-escalation training, and that consists of addressing a situation with the least amount of force first, all the way up to deadly force, which would be the use of your service weapon. I tend to think that there's a lot of training that's involved in police work that is related to what other writers have called the warrior training model, where police officers are trained to do police work in a warrior environment, a warrior mentality, a we against they. And I experienced that in the training academy when I started in police work. Now we talk about the training of police officers in a different model, in the sense of being a guardian, an individual who works in the community, represent the community, but also one who approaches police work from a service-oriented model. And that's why I believe that's where we're going to. But police departments, as well as individuals in policing, tend to be very slow, and they have short memories when it comes to the kind of things that are related to training and other educational models. The power that police have, I think, is the power that comes from, it's a legislative power, but the real power I believe that police officers have is the power that's given to them by the citizens and the residents of a particular area. If you would allow me to talk a little bit about the history of policing in America, police departments were started around 1844, 1845. And I think in New York City was the first organized police department that we might have had in this country. Policing in an international context was around 1829 in the city of London, and it was first talked about and developed by a guy, organized policing, by the name of Robert Peel. And Peel was very successful in developing what he talked about, these Peel models in terms of how policing should operate. And I just want to just shoot a couple of them by you, that the police are the public and the public is the police. That was one of the Peel things he talked about. He also talked about that policing was a local phenomenon, that the power that police had was given to them by the citizens who live in a particular area. And believe it or not, in that model, and in the UK, police officers, not individuals, were drawn to police work, not only because police work was a community level kind of thing, but housing and those kind of other incentives were made available to police officers because they wanted them to live in the communities that they served. In this country, we talk about it and we call it residency. We like for police officers to live in the cities and municipalities that they work in. But that power structure existed in the UK and also in America. And we could go back further than the 1845, 1844 to a model that existed in this country called the hue and cry. And that was before organized police work. And that was individuals that were designated in our community that was designated. They didn't carry firearms or anything like that, but their power was vested in the fact that they worked in the community, and when they saw something that was going on, they would hollow out, and the individuals who was designed to be or designated to be police officers respond to the scene to handle that situation. But it was a partnership, a genuine, sincere partnership between the residents of a community and those individuals who was designated to be law enforcement officers. That model has changed tremendously. And it's very different than the model of policing and the power of policing as it relates to people of color. Black folk in this country, their experiences come out of the slave patrol and the powers that had to do with the maintenance and preservation of slavery in this country. So to understand it, then you need to understand the history of it and pretty much be aware of all of that. What we have today in America, in my opinion, hasn't really changed in terms of policing and the evolution of policing. I've been involved in working and talking about these issues for some time. A friend of mine took over a police department in New England about 30 years ago. And when he took over the police department, he was concerned about the training, because what you learn in the training environment, you bring into the actual working environment. So he got rid of, when he became chief of police, he got rid of the police person that was in charge of the training academy. And he hired someone from academia, because he wanted his police training mechanism to be an education, a police education academy, rather than a police training academy. See, because training and education are very different. And education is much more comprehensive, much more valuable I believe, in the policing environment than training. And so he was very successful. He utilized not only this individual for academia as someone who was controlling and over top of the education academy, but also in terms of recruitment and other issues that they were going on and dealing with in the police department. So the models today need to be changed. I don't even like the idea of calling police departments training academies. I think they ought to be changed to education academy. And we ought to look at the model in which how we go about educating police officers and what we educate them to. Because once they come out on the street from the education academy, then they're going to be reflective and behave in the model that they were conditioned to and exposed to within the academy itself. And if we want the individuals that go in to be guardians, then the education of that individual, the things that happen to him or her while they're in the academy, have to be related to what it is that we want them to do when they come out. So I just think that those are relatively related questions and very important, but they're done in the training today is still done in the old model. And again, we need to, I believe, for example, we need to pay less attention to the firearms training and more, for example, more emphasis on how you talk to people, communication, problem solving, being able to, there's a strategy that social workers use called MI, and I can't even think what MI stand for some reason. It passed through me just that quick. But it's a method of talking to people, asking open questions, attempting to find out why and what it is that they may be involved in their situation right now, rather than accusatory and cutting off the conversation. So there's a variety of new things that does exist in the education of police officers, as well as how police officers go about doing their job every day. I would say this lastly is that over the years, I've seen a great deal of emphasis, because of how we talk about training police officers. When something goes wrong in a police department, the law enforcement community and those who subscribe very closely to it start talking about, we need to redesign the training, or we need to expose them to more training. I don't happen to believe, I'm not a believer of the fact that training is wrong. Police officers are do exactly what they're trained to do. If you want them to do something different than what they've been doing, then we need to educate them and provide a different level and a different kind of exposure. If we want them at the end of their education experience to be different than what we've traditionally had. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so we are now going to turn to Rachel and allow her to introduce us to the laws that have established police power. And then we'll open this up for some good conversation. Remember to drop any questions and comments that you have in the chat as we go, and we will be sure to loop back around.
Thank you, Dr. Watson, and thank you to your team for all your hard work in putting this very important program together at a critical moment in American history. I want to talk this evening about the legal structure for why the police have the power that they do and the leeway that courts have given police officers in everyday encounters with citizens that lead to the vast majority of police brutality cases. And specifically, I want to talk about what we call Terry stops, racial profiling, and qualified immunity, the doctrine that protects officers from being sued for their actions. All of these together, and 3 Supreme Court cases in particular, have excused racial profiling in this country and in many ways validated it for decades now. So I want to start with a case called Terry versus Ohio. This was decided by the United States Supreme Court in 1968. And to just begin with the facts to give you a sense of the story here, this takes place in Cleveland, Ohio. An officer named Officer McFadden observed a number of men, including Mr. Terry, walking in downtown Cleveland. He had not seen them before, and he couldn't say why he didn't like them, but he said they, quote, just didn't look right to me. Now, his experience as a police officer was that he had 39 years in law enforcement, 35 of those years he'd spent as a detective, and 30 of those years he'd spent patrolling downtown Cleveland. So I'm just going to interrupt here to say nobody stays on patrol for 30 years. And perhaps Officer Hampton can back me up on this. Highly unusual background for a police officer to stay in that position in a particular area. So what Officer McFadden claims is that he believes these men are casing the joint, which is just a term to mean that he thought that they were looking suspiciously at a store with the intention of robbing that store. When the officer was later asked if in all of his years patrolling downtown Cleveland, whether he'd ever before observed somebody casing the joint, he said no. Again, astonishing testimony from a police officer allegedly doing this kind of work every day. So Officer McFadden is about 300 to 400 feet away from the men. He sees them looking into this store window repeatedly, talking with each other for about 10 to 12 minutes. He's suspicious, so he approaches all 3 men, including Mr. Terry. He identifies himself as a police officer. He asks for the names of these men. Because they mumble something in response, Officer McFadden grabs Mr. Terry, spins him around, and then pats him down, touches him, and claims to feel something that he thinks is a gun in Mr. Terry's left chest pocket. Officer McFadden then reached inside his clothing and found a .38 caliber weapon from Mr. Terry. At that point, the officer ordered all 3 of the men to raise their hands against the wall, patted them down, found another gun on one of the other men, and had the store owner call police to take all these men to the station. So Mr. Terry was charged with carrying a concealed weapon and was convicted. The question, by the time we get to the United States Supreme Court, so this has gone through several courts, including a jury trial and a federal appellate court, and now in front of the United States Supreme Court, the question is, the Fourth Amendment states a standard that police must meet before they just stop and grab a citizen on the street. That standard is called probable cause, meaning that there is some probable belief that the citizen has engaged in some unlawful conduct. In this case, no one argued that Officer McFadden had probable cause. And so the question for the court was, would the court lower the legal standard to say that police could stop and seize a citizen on the street without probable cause, the constitutional standard? The answer to that question was yes. The court decided that the police could reasonably seize and frisk a person for weapons even when there was no Fourth Amendment probable cause, and arrest that person if the police had what the court called a reasonable and articulable suspicion that the person was engaging in criminal conduct. And so what you have here is a situation where the police can conduct a warrantless search or seizure right on the street, even when there's no probable cause. And this court basically exempts police from the usual Fourth Amendment standard. There are a number of ironic and really troubling things about this decision, including that Terry was written by Chief Justice Earl Warren, the man who wrote the Brown versus Board of Education decision and wrote a lot of other groundbreaking decisions, including decisions that had a really positive impact on the civil rights movement. Terry, of course, had a very negative impact on the movement and on people of color in particular. And so the court acknowledged that being searched by a police officer was not just a petty indignity, as they called it. They also acknowledged that there were many kinds of street encounters between citizens and police. They acknowledged that there was, quote, wholesale harassment by certain elements of the police, of which African Americans frequently noted, but the court claimed that the trial process would not be helped by listening to these concerns. And scholars, including me, have questioned, is this true? And so the key to the Terry case is that reasonableness it really involves a police officer's suspicion that someone is engaging in criminal behavior when the police officer has the opportunity to witness that person at close range. One of the ironies of the Terry case is that Officer McFadden could not articulate a suspicion, nor were any of his fears reasonable based on this record, and yet the court used this case to say that police must have a reasonable and articulable suspicion. And so this case has huge implications for everyday policing because it really removes from police the requirement to comply with otherwise applicable Fourth Amendment standards. The next case that involves police encounters with citizens is Wren versus United States. That was issued by the court in 1996. One of the surprising things about this decision is, though it remains highly controversial, it was written by a unanimous court. In other words, not a single justice disagreed with this opinion. So again, just stepping back, let me tell you about the facts of this case of Wren versus United States. This takes place in Washington, D.C. There were officers involved in the Vice Squad who were patrolling what they said was a high drug area of Washington, D.C. They were patrolling in an unmarked car. They noticed at some point a young man stalled at a stop sign, whom they claimed made some evasive movements to get away from their car. So the police stopped this truck. They identified themselves as police, and then they claimed that they observed crack cocaine in the hands of the defendant, the driver of the car. Multiple young men were arrested. The police said they found drugs in the car. All the defendants are African American, and the defendants admit that the police officers had probable cause, again, the Fourth Amendment standard, to stop the truck for traffic violations. They acknowledged that they violated the traffic law, which most Americans do on a pretty regular basis without even knowing it. But they said that the reason the police stopped them was simply because they're African American. And so the question for the Supreme Court was, does the Constitution absolutely prohibit racial profiling under the Fourth Amendment? The answer was no. And so the court held in Wren that an officer's subjective motive doesn't invalidate objectively justifiable behavior under the Fourth Amendment. In other words, when a motorist is detained for violating traffic laws, even if the officer's real reason for stopping that motorist is because of racial profiling, the Fourth Amendment doesn't protect a citizen from that police encounter. And so what's going on in the officer's head, including his bias, has no role to play in how the courts look at that officer interaction with a citizen. Now, the court said that they agreed that the Constitution prohibits selective enforcement of the law, that race should not be a consideration, but they said under the Fourth Amendment, under the amendment that defendants accused of criminal wrongdoing can invoke in a criminal proceeding, that the subjective motives, that the bias of police are not relevant. This case, of course, remains highly controversial, including because the United States Department itself has conducted studies that show that people of color, particularly African American men, have higher levels of contact with law enforcement. And so this case remains the law, despite the fact that we've had multiple attorneys general who are African American and people of color who have expressed their concern about racial profiling. Wren says it is not illegal under the Fourth Amendment. The final case that I want to talk about is called Graham versus O'Connor. And this really has to do with why it's so hard to sue police when these violent encounters happen. This case was decided in 1989, and 6 justices joined this opinion with the then Chief Justice, William Rehnquist. This is a civil suit. This is not a criminal action, but it arose out of a criminal conviction. So just to step back again and give you a picture of the story that led to this case. This happens in North Carolina. A young man named Thorne Graham was diabetic. In 1984, he felt that he was getting an insulin reaction. He asked his friend to drive him to the store to buy him some juice. Well, they got to the store. Graham walked inside. He saw that the line was very long, and he didn't think that he had that much time given his reaction. So he left the store right away, and he asked his friend to drive him to another friend's house where he hoped he could get some juice to treat his medical condition. At that point, a Charlotte, North Carolina police officer, Officer Connor, became suspicious simply because he saw Graham walk in and out of the store very quickly. And so he made an investigative stop. At the time that he started speaking to Mr. Graham, Graham's friends, explained that he was suffering from diabetes, that he was having a reaction, and that he simply needed to get some sugar. They all pleaded with the officers to allow Graham to get some sugar to treat his reaction. The police ignored those pleas, and they cuffed him, and the officer called for backup. One of the officers who arrived on scene was quoted as saying, "I've seen a lot of people with sugar diabetes that never acted like this. Ain't nothing wrong with this blankety blank, but drunk. Lock this blankety blank up." So that tells you kind of the mindset that they were approaching this with, not as if Mr. Graham needed medical help, which he did, but as if he was a threat to the order. So at that point, multiple officers got involved, threw Mr. Graham on the car hood, ignored his request to have them check for his diabetic decal, and then threw him head first into the police car. They finally released him, but at that point, he'd suffered a broken foot, cuts on his wrist, a bruised forehead, an injured shoulder, and permanent ear damage. So he sued the police officers under civil law, claiming that they had violated his constitutional rights. And the question before the court then was, what's the constitutional standard by which we judge a police officer's use of force? This is a critical question that comes up all the time, almost every day in this country. And so the court said the constitutional standard is we're back to the Fourth Amendment, but it's an objective standard. It doesn't matter what was in the police officer's head, and we won't use the traditional civil rights standard under the 14th Amendment, one of the Civil War amendments, called the substantive due process standard. And so the court basically said excessive force claims must be judged by whether or not they were reasonable in the mind of the police officer. And so the court in that case ultimately sent it back to the lower court to make that decision. But the reality of Graham versus Connor today is that all sorts of police behavior is excused as reasonable because of police perception of danger, even where, as with the Graham versus Connor case, a person's actually suffering a medical reaction and not conducting any kind of criminal activity. Together, these 3 cases, Terry, Wren, and Graham, create very powerful protections for the police that make it difficult to A, question any police stop. B, challenge the police stop as racially motivated. And C, sue the police successfully when a person is injured because of police brutality.
Okay. Almost feel like you shut that conversation down. Not sure what to do with that. All right, so I'm going
It's
to,
shocking.
yeah, for those of us not in the field of law, first time I'm hearing some of this, so I'm just stunned. So I'm going to turn this back over to Alexi and Alan to get us started on our Q&A. So everyone get primed with your questions. I hope you've been dropping them in and we'll get going.
Those were both really great presentations that you guys had. I was very, very surprised about the cases that you were describing. And I find it, I actually said it in the chat myself. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to say my question first. I'm just wondering, this kind of has to do connecting both of what you guys were talking about. So I'm wondering, are police officers aware in like their training of what rights and laws that they have, like how they're able to like just like kind of as you described it, like they basically handcuffed him and threw him into the car. Are they aware that they're allowed to do those things, or is that just something that they've kind of are conditioned to act like? I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
Go ahead, Professor.
I was going to ask our former officer to respond first, and then I can follow up with sort of the legal perspective on what I think the context is.
Okay. No, that's interesting, and I would say this. I would say a couple of things, and I think the professor would agree with me. She's in Minneapolis. I'm in Washington, D.C. If you were to walk up to a police officer on the street and ask him or her to identify with some degree of understanding the three decisions that you just talked about, I'm willing to bet you that they couldn't. And they don't know. They don't know the substance of them. What they know is what they were taught or talked about in the training academy, and then they use what police officers use most of the time in being police officers, and that is seeing a crime committed and then making an arrest, because they know that in order for you to make an arrest, you have to have, there's something that's called the elements of a crime. And if those elements exist, then you can make the arrest. But that's a visual thing. But do they walk around, drive around, ride on bicycles around, understanding what those three important cases are? Hell no, they don't. And if you ask the average one, they couldn't cite them back to you and tell you what it is. But they understand what it means to make a drug arrest when they see the drug, or they understand what a traffic violation arrest is when they see a person run a red light, and then after they see the person run the red light, then they know that they can pull them over, stop them, write a ticket for running the red light. But then their mind starts to rolling, and they want to search the car because, and especially if the individual is Black, and not because of terror, not because of wind, but because the person is Black, and somehow in America and on the streets of our cities in this country, if you're Black and driving a nice car, then you might be selling drugs. And so they use that to be able to say, I want to search your car. So then if they get a consent to search your car, and my advice to people on here and anybody is, you don't give the police consent to search your car. And the reason you don't give the police permission to search your car is because you don't know what's in it. That's the first reason why. The second reason why, if you give them consent to search your car, then you have lost your battle with them, because then they can search your car. So you don't give them consent. Now, can you stop them from searching your car while they're in the act of doing it? No. No, you can't stop them, and you don't want to stop them. Because when you get ready to go to court, then the lawyers will tell you, then you will have a right of action to claim the violation of your Fourth Amendment right, protection against search or seizures. So those are the kind of things. But do they know about those three things and use them in an attempt to misuse them? No, they don't. I just don't believe that.
I agree with everything that Officer Hampton has said, and I think that, so I'll answer this question in three parts. I don't think we expect most police to be constitutional scholars. So they might not know about the specific case, but they do know that they have tremendous discretion, and that discretion is not going to be questioned by prosecutors or by the courts. And so that's, I think, an important piece to remember. Secondly, police officers do work hand in hand with prosecutors. And so whether we're talking about local police officers working with the county attorneys or city attorneys, or officers working with federal prosecutors, they depend on the prosecutor to justify their action under the legal framework. They take the steps that they think they need to do to apprehend criminals, but then they turn their file over to prosecutors who construct the legal analysis of why this behavior is acceptable. And basically, based on those three cases, in addition to many more, prosecutors and police both know that working together, much of police action cannot be challenged because of the legal system that we have in this country and how it's been interpreted by the Supreme Court. The third thing I'll say is, the irony of these cases, these three that I think are sort of critical to daily race relations, is that Officer Hampton observed that, police might not know about the laws, they might not know about the Supreme Court cases, but what they know is they need to look for crimes happening. So in these three cases that I just described, in not a single case did police observe a felony crime happening. And so what they observed were African-American men just walking down the street looking in a store, or they observed African-American men driving a car, maybe violating a traffic violation, not stopping long enough at a stop sign, but not a felony crime at that moment. Or in the third case, what they observed was an African-American man having a diabetic reaction, not a person committing a crime. And so again, what I want to emphasize is that it's not even necessary for the police today to observe a crime. They just need to have a suspicion. And as long as they have a suspicion, they count on prosecutors to help them package that suspicion. And then in some cases, as in the Wren case, the second case that I talked about, if they find drugs after making the initial stop, they know that a court is going to back them up fully on the initial circumstances of their encounters with people, especially African-American men and people of color generally.
Does anyone else have any questions about, yes.
So to start off, I believe that our first question came from Casey Smith, and his question was pretty lengthy. It was mentioned earlier in the presentation, but he said, does de-escalation training include learning techniques to de-escalate a situation, like what we are trained to do in mental health settings, or is it more not escalating by not meeting a situation with behaviors that actively make things worse? And he also mentioned, on a similar note, what education for officers exists regarding the psychology of mental health crisis, addiction, and crime, and or the philosophies of policing and justice? If this education doesn't exist, is there any conversation about making that part of training? Making that part of training.
Yeah, there are discussions going on now in the context of reform restructuring activities by these commissions and task force in cities that's looking at the ineffective response of police officers to calls for individuals experiencing mental health episodes. And what they're concluding is that the public would be better served having mental health experts and clinicians responding to calls for service rather than police officers as the first responders. Now, there are a few municipalities in the country where they're doing this either as a pilot project or as part of their response, that mental health, public health professionals are responding to calls for service. When they get there, they evaluate it. If they can handle it, they will. If they need the assistance of an officer, then they ask for it. There's also a couple of examples where mental health professionals and police officers who've been exposed to extra training, which is really education, really extra education about how to work with people who are experiencing mental health episodes, individuals with autism, individuals with other developmental disabilities. And then they have an agreement with the Department of Behavioral Health that they have a dual response to these, handling these calls, and they're doing it. What the studies and the evidence have shown us is that police aren't haven't been effective. That hasn't been an effective response from police officers. Having been a police officer myself, some of the behavior that these individuals display while they're involved in these episodes, it can be perceived by a police officer or person as threatening, and they will use their weapon or some other non-lethal weapon on these individuals rather than try to provide the service that they need reference to the issue that they happen to be experiencing. So this is ongoing kind of conversation and pilot projects that are looking at that. And that's very different than de-escalation. De-escalation is a strategy that has been introduced into policing now for some time, where they educate, and I call it education because what they do is they talk to you about, first you talk to the individual and you try to calm the individual down. You try to ask them questions. You try to get them involved in the conversation. And then you go to the next level up. And that could be using some kind of threatening language. Then there's a level after that where you would maybe use your nightstick or your mace or something like that. Then there's the next level. And then ultimately the last level is use of deadly force. That's de-escalation training. Because the idea is that when you respond to a call, there's a situation going on. And sometimes the situation is one that where people are engaged in some kind of behavior, and your job, your responsibility, your obligation as a police officer is to de-escalate a situation rather than to escalate it out of control, and applying and use of force in a situation that is already escalating. The purpose is to de-escalate the situation rather than to escalate it out of control. And so to me, that's an education process. That's not a training. A training is something where you're given an example of a particular, let's say, behavior or an action, and then you're told how to handle it and then demonstrated how to handle it. And then that's what they expect you to do. That's a training. That's very different than in education, where you're provided with alternatives in terms of strategies to implement and utilize based on what you confront. That's the difference between education and training to me.
Okay, the next question in the chat
Oh,
is.
can I jump in before we move on? Just, I think, I guess I'm having a wanting to connect a little bit between our two presenters this evening and sort of ask about these gray areas that's that both of you seem to be kind of pointing at, for me anyway. So, you know, as a citizen, do I have the right to say to an officer and expect an answer, I guess would be the other part of that. Why am I being pulled over? Or is that already seen as me escalating the situation and being belligerent in some sort of way? And now all of a sudden I've given them reason to interact with me in a different kind of way. Can I ask the question of why are you pulling me over? What's your badge number? I guess I'm sort of hearing these places where if everything is about how the officer is perceiving and there are no challenges to those perceptions that are being admitted, then it feels a little bit right now like no matter what I do, I'm now being perceived as someone who's not cooperating.
If the attorney would allow me to say this real quick, and then I know I think she should respond to this. At 5, 6 o'clock in the evening in Black communities, in residents in Black communities, there's something that takes place. It's called the talk, and the talk is a conversation that takes place usually from a Black father and a mother to a Black son or daughter about how to behave when you're stopped by the police, whether you're walking, riding, flying, or running. The talk takes place. And the talk essentially is about how to navigate that engagement so you can walk away. Right. Not for you to take a low, not for you to somehow or another to be embarrassed, but so you can understand how to navigate the thing. And I've had to talk with my daughters. I have 2 daughters and a son. My son happened to be a person with autism, but my 2 daughters drive. So I've had that talk with them. Yes, you can ask why you're being stopped, and believe it or not, by policy, the police officer is supposed to tell you why he or she is stopping you. You can ask other questions. In the talk, what I say to said to my children and other folk is that you say yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. That's courteous. You show courteous. You show your hands. You don't be wiggling around in the seat, because those that kind of behavior can ultimately end up in a way that you don't want it to be. You need to follow the instructions that he or she might give you. And the best thing to do is you can ask them for their name and badge number. You can ask them other questions too, and I think you just do it in a diplomatic way, in a diplomatic manner, and that's it. I know I have myself. I've even, because the time that I've been stopped, I don't tell them that I'm a retired police officer or that I was a police officer. I start asking questions just like anybody else in the public. What did I do, officer? Can you tell me what I violated? If he or she gets out of hand, then I tell them that I'm a police officer, because I want them to know that I'm aware of the proper behavior that they are supposed to display. And if they don't display it, I'm going to see their supervisor. I don't, that's what I'm saying. Now I don't recommend that my daughter say that to them, but there's a conversation that she should have, because we are protected. That's protected conversation that you can have with a law enforcement officer, and they should be able to answer you. If you lived in LA, if you lived in Los Angeles, California, there's a court ruling that provides, that says in LA, Los Angeles Police Department, that when an officer stops you, whether you're walking, flying, or riding, they have to give you a card, their business card. If you ask them questions, they had to give you their business card that has their name, telephone number, email address, and all that kind of information on it. And I think that's a policy in a few other places too. But you can ask an officer for that kind of information, and he or she should be able to give you to me. Now, there are, excuse the expression, there are unreasonable individuals in every walk of life, and there's a chance that you may run into one, but you can ask the question. Yes, ma'am.
So just to tie that into what Officer Hampton was saying, to tie that into the law, the Supreme Court, Dr. Watson has said repeatedly, you don't have to talk to the police. In fact, if you're just walking down the street, minding your own business, and you're stopped by the police, you can just walk away without saying a word. That's your constitutional right. Now, the reality is, as we all know, that you are likely to be perceived as non-cooperative if you fail to answer questions, if you fail to be respectful, obsequiously respectful, if you fail to engage with that police officer. And I'll just tell you my own experience as a woman of color in asking the question. I'm constantly stopped, including every single time I go through the airport security screening. And so on my last trip back from a business trip to an international zone, I asked the customs agent, why did you stop me? Did you stop me because of what you perceive as my ethnicity? And he said, well, yes, because you could be from, and then he proceeded to name at least 4 continents that my ancestors could have come from. And I said, well, that's interesting because you've just named about 4 billion people on this planet. If you're planning on stopping every one of us as we go through the airport, I think that's remarkable. And what I think is really sad is that my family has been in this community for 15 years. I'm an American citizen. I gave 15 years of my life to serve my country as a prosecutor, and all you can see is the color of my skin. And that probably was more than I should have said if I were following the rules of the talk. But I felt at that moment that he needed to know that what he was doing was illegal, inappropriate, and personally deeply hurtful. And so for all these people where, it doesn't matter, they don't know where I went to school, they don't know what my profession is, they don't know my socioeconomic status, all they see is a person of color. It shouldn't matter what my credentials are. And that was my point to him. But part of the reason I wanted to lay out the case law, because I think your question is such a good one, Dr. Watson, on how we navigate those encounters with police, is that the law has to be changed. Police right now are given almost unfettered discretion, and they are not questioned about these everyday encounters that lead to a lot of violence and discrimination and just daily microaggressions and macroaggressions against people of color.
No, and I would add that there are 2 things that we have been working on here with other folk nationally, and that is the elimination of qualified immunity, the same thing that they brought up in the Graham case, right? And consent searches. It's no such thing, in my opinion, having been a police officer, when a police officer, individual in a uniform, I'm 6'5". When I was on the force, I'm a little heavier now, but when I was on the force, I weighed 225, 6'5", and I'm standing over some youth or even an adult, and I say, can I search your car? Or can I search you? I don't think them saying yes is consent. They're doing it because I'm a police officer, because I'm standing over them. Let's be real. And that's what I say to folks. So and especially when you're dealing with youth, there's no such thing. So I think we need to eliminate the whole notion of this consent search, and then qualified immunity. Let me shorten up what happens in qualified community. You abuse me, I sue you. The money that I'm going to win from the city don't come out the police officer's pocket. It comes out the city coffer's pocket, out of the taxes that I pay. So now I'm paying you double, not your salary and other money, so that you can abuse me because you have qualified immunity. It is insane. So we need to eliminate qualified immunity. It doesn't make sense because it hasn't worked for us, the people who disproportionately been affected by it.
So I'm going to read another question from the chat as well. So Adriana asked for you, Mr. Hampton, for you to emphasize on the education. Like, what do you think would be helpful in regards to education, like being educated on what specifically? Like, what do you think, I guess what she was trying to say is like, what do you think should be changed about the education or what should be implemented?
Well, first of all, let me use for an example. In the UK, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in New Zealand, I believe in Germany, I know in Canada, police officers go to college. They don't go to a training academy, they go to a police college. And when they graduate from the police college, they also then go to work as police officers, but they have a degree. We don't have that in America. We have training academies, and I think maybe one of the longest police academies that exists are some of the ones that exist at the state level, where we watch individuals that join the state troopers may go to training for a year. But in the average police department, it's probably somewhere between 6 to 8 months, and then you go out on the street. There's a difference between a training academy and a police college. And what I'm talking about is a college. And what subjects take place in the police college is the same subjects that take place in any college, because those are the things that police officers need to be armed with in terms of what they're going to do every single day in our community. They need to know how to talk. They need to know how to communicate. And talking and communication is the same thing, but they need to master that. They need to master de-escalation. They need to know how to talk with people. They know how to handle people. They need to know how to handle situations. All of that kind of stuff is what you learn in college. And in the police colleges in the countries that I named, those are the subjects that police officers learn. So when they come out of there, they're a much well-rounded individual. And that's what we need and would like, I believe we need to have as individuals that are serving in our cities and in our police departments. And that's very different than traditionally what we have who have come out of police training academies, all right?
This is also another great question I wanted to bring up. I think both of you could elaborate and touch on this, and this is from Dave Smith. It's, what is the balance between police not endangering their lives in the line of duty and enforcing the law and properly addressing situations of various types?
Do you want to go first, officer, or would you like me to take that first? You're on mute, my friend, so I can't hear you.
Oh, go ahead. Because I was thinking about, I was trying to think of an example, but.
That is the question that we have to grapple with, right? And so I think it's useful to think about, does it have to be this way? And I think the answer to that is no. Do we have the balance? Do we have the line drawn in the right place right now? No, we don't. And so where is a different place to draw the line? I agree with Officer Hampton that qualified immunity, which is being challenged by people on the left as well as people on the right, is a real problem. I think that we could look to the examples of other nations where in sort of everyday street encounters in Britain, for example, police are not armed.
Thank you.
And so this assumption that just street beat police need to pull out their weapons every time they're encountering somebody in just a street situation, I think is an overreaction to what should be a less violent encounter. I also think that these models of community policing, where the police know the people whose neighborhoods they're patrolling, where they're getting to know citizens, where they're getting to know ministers in the community, where they're getting to know other community leaders is really important. But right now we have this disconnect between, who's got the badge and the gun and who's actually in the community. And so they don't view themselves as, I shouldn't say they, many police officers, too many, do not view themselves as really serving the community. But we also know that in terms of the power dynamics, that it is very different when police are dealing with people of color versus when they're dealing with white people. We know that African American and Hispanic people are 50% more likely to experience police aggression. We know that 1 in 1,000 Black men will be killed by the police. I know that in my city, right here in Minneapolis, that police are 7 times more likely to use force on an African American person than a person from any other background. We know that unarmed African American people are twice as likely to be shot by the police than unarmed white people. Those are not my opinions. Those are facts that have been shown by scientists, by the media, and by police departments themselves. And so given these facts, given we know that the line isn't drawn in the right place right now, whatever we do, I don't think we can afford to keep the status quo.
No, I agree with you. And since you quoted some of those facts, so let me quote a couple of facts and studies that around somewhere between 95 to 98% of individuals who join police departments, retire from police departments, never ever using their service weapon in defense of their life or someone else's life. And we have over 18,000 police departments in America. Now, did you hear what I said? Somewhere between 95 to 80 to 98% of individuals who join police departments, retire from police departments, never ever using their weapon in defense of their life or some other person's life. So the smartest thing that an individual who happens to be a police officer can do is use his brain and his mouth, not his weapon. It's unfortunate in America that weapons are associated with being police, but in pretty much in other countries, police officers don't have weapons. I know in the country of Canada, you go to work, you get your weapon when you go to work, and when you leave work, you turn your weapon into the armory. You don't take your weapon home with you. There are also studies that show that most police officers get into trouble with their weapon in off-duty status. And yet, the policy about the use of your weapon is the same whether you're on duty or off duty. Now, did you hear what I said? So the US could learn from some of the things that other countries are doing as it relates to this whole idea of the weapon. Of the 24 years that I was on the police department, I never had to use my weapon. I don't even think I ever pulled it out, maybe 1 or 2 times. But the fact of the matter is that the more people I knew in my community, I happened to, in the first 8 years of my career, I walked the footbeat in my community. Mm-hmm. Now, the more people I knew in my community, the safer I felt. Mm-hmm. My gun wasn't going to do anything in terms of protecting me, but the people in my community was my protection margin because of the people that I knew. And so I think that that's the case. You do, however, I saw something I saw something in the chat about people coming on the job and expecting certain things. Yeah, there are individuals who join police departments and they join out of a sense of adventure rather than a sense of service. And there are people who would push back rather on what I said. But the job of being a police officer is really about being a service to people. It's not about cops and robbers and adventure. That's not what police work is about. And that's why I think that also needs to be a thread throughout the education of police officers, the whole idea of service rather than adventure, because a lot of individuals join police departments looking for that adventure and ultimately end up finding themselves involved in a situation with use of service weapon or something like that, rather than in the spirit of service. And that's important.
So looking at the time now, it seems that we're actually done here. And I just want to say that these were great conversations that we were having. And I personally have learned a lot throughout watching and listening to you guys. So I'm going to be talking pretty briefly about this opportunity here. It's called Fix the Six. And if you want to talk more about conversations such as this, please join. And you can find it on the senatorhaywood.com/anti-racism. And if this intrigues you. And I just want to say thank you to everybody that showed up. And I want to thank our panelists, Mr. Ronald Hampton and Mrs. Rachel Palouse. I'm so happy to work with you guys. I know we talked a lot via email, but it's such a great time to like listen to you guys and just absorb all the knowledge that you guys have. It was great.
Thank you all, and thanks to Dr. Watson as well. And your whole
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, Maisha, you want to mention?
Yes, I was waiting for the cue. Thank you. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us tonight. Should you need an attendance voucher for your attendance tonight at this town hall, the link is in the chat and you just click it and print it for yourselves. This concludes and wraps up our town hall series for this year. It's been a blast. Thank you so much for all of the brilliant work that you've done in our communities and continue to do.
Thank you,
Take care,
everyone.
everyone.
Have a great night, everybody.
You too.
Good night.
night.